Marcus Thompson wiped his oil-stained hands on the already dirty rag hanging from his belt as he crawled out from underneath the old Ford pickup truck. His coveralls were soaked with grease, and his face bore the familiar streaks of motor oil that had become his daily uniform. The small auto repair shop in downtown San Diego had seen better days, with its peeling paint and rusty tools, but it was home to Marcus and his dreams. At 28 years old, Marcus had been working on cars since he was 14, learning from his grandfather who had run the same shop for 40 years before passing it down to him. The neighborhood had changed dramatically over the years, with upscale restaurants and boutique stores replacing the blue-collar businesses that once lined the street. Marcus often felt like a relic from another time, struggling to keep his family business alive in an increasingly gentrified area. The morning sun streamed through the grimy windows as Marcus examined the transmission he had just repaired. Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman from the neighborhood, would be picking up her car later that day, and he wanted to make sure everything was perfect. She had been bringing her vehicles to the shop since his grandfather's time, and Marcus took pride in maintaining the trust his family had built over decades. As he worked, Marcus couldn't help but notice the way some of the newer residents looked at him when he walked down the street in his work clothes. The sideways glances and hurried steps past his shop had become increasingly common. He understood that his appearance might not fit the polished image the neighborhood was cultivating, but he had never let it bother him too much. His work spoke for itself, and he knew the value of honest labor. The bell above the door chimed as his first customer of the day walked in. Marcus looked up to see a well-dressed businessman in an expensive suit, looking around the shop with obvious distaste. The man's nose wrinkled as he took in the smell of motor oil and the cluttered workspace that surrounded them. "I need someone to look at my BMW," the man said curtly, not bothering with pleasantries. "The engine is making a strange noise, and I need it fixed immediately. I have important meetings all day." Marcus nodded and grabbed his diagnostic equipment. "I'd be happy to take a look. Can you describe the noise you're hearing?" The businessman rolled his eyes. "That's what I'm paying you to figure out, isn't it? Just fix it quickly. I don't have time to waste in a place like this." Despite the man's rudeness, Marcus maintained his professional demeanor as he examined the luxury vehicle parked outside. Within minutes, he had identified the problem: a loose serpentine belt that would take less than an hour to replace. It was a simple fix that any competent mechanic could handle. "I found the issue," Marcus explained, returning to where the businessman waited. "It's just a belt that needs replacing. I can have it done in about 45 minutes for $80. The man looked skeptical. "How do I know you're not trying to rip me off? You people always try to overcharge for simple work." Marcus felt a familiar sting at the comment but kept his voice steady. "Sir, I've been working on cars for over 14 years. I'm giving you an honest assessment and a fair price. If you'd like a second opinion, you're welcome to take your car elsewhere." "Don't get smart with me," the businessman snapped. "Just fix it and don't try any funny business. I'll be watching." As Marcus worked on the BMW, he could feel the man's eyes on him, scrutinizing every move. Other customers came and went during the repair, and Marcus noticed how differently they were treated. When a well-dressed woman brought in her Mercedes, the businessman struck up a friendly conversation with her, complaining about having to deal with these types of places because his regular mechanic was unavailable. The woman nodded sympathetically, casting disapproving looks in Marcus's direction. "You really can't trust them," she said quietly. "They always try to find extra things wrong with your car to make more money." Marcus pretended not to hear the conversation, but each word felt like a small blow to his pride. He had never cheated a customer in his life, and his reputation in the neighborhood had always been built on honesty and quality work. Yet here were strangers making assumptions about his character based solely on his appearance and occupation. When he finished the repair, Marcus tested the engine to ensure everything was working properly. The BMW purged beautifully, with no trace of the previous noise. He felt the satisfaction that always came with solving a problem and helping someone, even when that someone had treated him poorly. "All done," Marcus announced, handing the businessman his keys. "That'll be $80, just as I quoted." The man inspected his car suspiciously, as if expecting to find some damage or evidence of shoddy work. Finding nothing wrong, he reluctantly pulled out his wallet and counted out the exact amount in cash, making it clear he wouldn't be leaving a tip. "This better not break down again," he warned, as if the original problem had somehow been Marcus's fault. "It won't," Marcus replied simply. "I guarantee all my work." As the BMW pulled away, Marcus returned to his other projects, trying to shake off the unpleasant encounter. This wasn't the first time he had faced such treatment, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. The changing demographics of the neighborhood meant dealing with more customers who saw him as beneath them despite his skills and dedication to his craft. The afternoon brought a steady stream of work, mostly from his regular customers who appreciated his expertise and fair prices. Mrs. Rodriguez arrived to pick up her truck, delighted with the smooth operation of her newly repaired transmission. An old-timer named Joe stopped by to have his oil changed and stayed to chat about the neighborhood's transformation, lamenting the loss of the community spirit that had once defined the area. As closing time approached, Marcus was cleaning up his workspace when he heard raised voices from the street outside. Through the window, he could see a small crowd gathered around a black sedan that had apparently broken down in front of the coffee shop next door. The driver, a middle-aged man in military fatigues, stood beside his vehicle looking frustrated as steam poured from under the hood. Several well-dressed pedestrians had stopped to observe the situation, but none offered to help. Marcus could hear snippets of their conversation through the open window, comments about the eyesore of a broken-down car spoiling the aesthetic of their trendy street, and suggestions that the man should call a tow truck to remove his vehicle as quickly as possible. The military man appeared to be making phone calls, presumably trying to reach a mechanic or towing service, but was having little success. Marcus watched as the crowd grew larger, with more people stopping to gawk at the situation rather than offer assistance. Some pulled out their phones to take pictures, as if the man's predicament was entertainment for their social media feeds. Something about the scene bothered Marcus deeply. Here was someone clearly in need of help, yet the gathered crowd seemed more concerned with their own inconvenience than with offering aid to a fellow human being. The man's military uniform suggested he had served his country, which made the lack of community support even more troubling. Marcus made a decision that would change his life forever. He grabbed his toolbox and headed toward the door, ready to offer his assistance whether it was welcomed or not. As he approached the disabled vehicle, he could hear more clearly the comments from the onlookers. "Someone should do something about this," complained a woman in designer clothing. "This isn't the kind of thing we want in our neighborhood. Probably can't even afford proper maintenance," added another voice. "These military types never take care of their equipment." Marcus felt his jaw clench at the ignorant comments, but he pushed forward, focused on the task at hand. The man in uniform looked up as he approached, and Marcus could see the mixture of frustration and embarrassment in his eyes. "Excuse me," Marcus said, setting down his toolbox. "I'm a mechanic from the shop down the street. Mind if I take a look?" The military man's expression shifted to one of relief and gratitude. "That would be great, thank you. I'm not sure what happened. The engine just started overheating and now it won't start at all." As Marcus lifted the hood and began his examination, he became aware of the murmurs from the crowd behind him. Some people seemed surprised that the grease monkey from the old auto shop was getting involved, while others made disparaging comments about his appearance and presumed abilities. "Hope he knows what he's doing." Someone whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Probably just wants to make a quick buck off this guy," added another voice. Marcus ignored the commentary and focused on the engine before him. Within moments, he had identified the problem: a burst radiator hose that had caused the engine to overheat and subsequently fail to start due to a thermal safety shutoff. It was a relatively simple fix that would require a replacement hose and some coolant, both of which he had in stock at his shop. "Good news," Marcus told the military man. "It's just a burst hose. I can have you back on the road in about 30 minutes if you don't mind waiting." "Are you serious?" the man asked, his face lighting up with relief. "I thought I'd be stuck here for hours waiting for a tow truck." "No problem at all," Marcus replied. "Let me grab the parts from my shop and I'll get you fixed up." As he jogged back to retrieve the necessary supplies, Marcus could hear the crowd's reactions behind him. Some seemed impressed by his quick diagnosis, while others remained skeptical about his abilities. The businessman from earlier that day was among the gathered onlookers, and Marcus caught him shaking his head disapprovingly. Returning with the replacement hose and coolant, Marcus set to work under the watchful eyes of the crowd. His movements were efficient and confident, the result of years of experience and natural mechanical aptitude. As he worked, the military man introduced himself as Commander Robert Hayes, recently returned from a deployment overseas and visiting San Diego on official business. "I can't tell you how much I appreciate this," Commander Hayes said as Marcus installed the new radiator hose. "I was starting to think I'd have to abandon the car and call a taxi." "That's what neighbors are for," Marcus replied, tightening the final connection. "Besides, it's always nice to help someone who's served our country." The comment seemed to resonate with Commander Hayes, who studied Marcus with new interest. "You know, I've been around a lot of different people in my career, and you can usually tell a person's character by how they respond when someone needs help. Most folks here seemed more concerned with their own convenience than lending a hand." Marcus finished adding coolant to the system and started the engine. It hummed smoothly with no signs of the previous problems. The small crowd that had gathered began to disperse as it became clear that the situation was resolved, many seeming disappointed that the drama was over. As Commander Hayes prepared to leave, he pulled out his wallet to pay for the repair. Marcus waved off the gesture, explaining that it was just a simple fix between neighbors. The commander insisted on at least covering the cost of parts, but Marcus could see this was a man who understood the value of genuine kindness. "Tell you what," Commander Hayes said, handing Marcus his business card. "I'm going to be in town for a few more days. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to call." Marcus accepted the card politely, not thinking much of the gesture at the time. Military officers probably handed out business cards all the time as a matter of courtesy. He certainly never expected to need the assistance of someone so far outside his usual circle of family, friends, and customers. As the black sedan pulled away and the street returned to normal, Marcus gathered his tools and headed back to his shop. The brief encounter had reminded him why he loved his work and his community. Despite the challenges he sometimes faced, there was something deeply satisfying about solving problems and helping people, regardless of their background or how they treated him in return. The rest of the evening passed quietly as Marcus finished his cleanup and prepared to close the shop. He reflected on the events of the day, from the rude businessman to the stranded commander and everything in between. These interactions were part of the fabric of his daily life, each one teaching him something about human nature and his place in the community. As he locked up the shop and headed home to his small apartment above the garage, Marcus had no way of knowing that his simple act of kindness toward Commander Hayes would soon change everything. The business card tucked in his wallet would prove to be more than just a polite gesture. It would become his lifeline when the very community he served turned against him in ways he never could have imagined. The neighborhood continued its slow transformation around him, with new businesses opening and old ones closing every month. Marcus remained constant in his dedication to honest work and fair treatment of all customers regardless of their attitude toward him. He took pride in maintaining the reputation his grandfather had built, and in carrying on the family tradition of service to the community. Little did he know that this tradition would soon be put to the ultimate test, and that the respect he had earned through years of hard work would mean nothing to those who judged him solely by his appearance. The real challenge to his character and his business was still to come, and when it arrived, he would discover who his true allies were in a world that often seemed stacked against people like him. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus had helped Commander Hayes with his broken-down car, and life had returned to its normal rhythm of repairs, regular customers, and the occasional challenging encounter with the neighborhood's newer residents. The shop was busier than usual, which Marcus attributed to word-of-mouth recommendations from satisfied customers and the approaching summer driving season, when people wanted their cars in top condition. On a particularly warm Thursday morning, Marcus was deep under the hood of a vintage Mustang when he heard unfamiliar voices outside his shop. The tone was argumentative, and he could make out fragments of heated conversation through the open bay doors. Setting down his wrench, he wiped his hands and moved toward the front of the shop to see what was happening. A group of well-dressed individuals stood on the sidewalk in front of his building, gesturing animatedly and pointing at various aspects of his property. Marcus recognized a few faces from the neighborhood business association meetings he had attended over the years, though he had always felt like an outsider at those gatherings where the focus seemed to be on attracting upscale clientele and eliminating anything that didn't fit the desired aesthetic. Leading the group was Victoria Sterling, a real estate developer who had been instrumental in many of the neighborhood's recent changes. She wore an immaculate white suit and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting her way. Marcus had heard rumors that she was interested in purchasing several properties on his block for a major redevelopment project. "This is exactly the kind of blight that's holding back our neighborhood's full potential," Victoria was saying to the assembled group. "Look at this place. The peeling paint, the oil stains on the sidewalk, the general air of neglect. It's completely inconsistent with the upscale image we're trying to cultivate." Marcus felt his stomach tighten as he realized they were discussing his shop. He had worked hard to maintain the property within his limited budget, but it was true that the building showed its age. The paint job was overdue, and years of automotive work had left their mark on the surrounding pavement. Still, the shop was clean, functional, and provided an essential service to the community. The zoning laws clearly state that automotive repair facilities are permitted in this area, said George Patterson, an older man who owned the hardware store 2 blocks away. "Thompson's been here for decades. You can't just force him out because you don't like the way his business looks." Victoria smiled coldly. "Oh, I'm not suggesting we force anyone out, George, but there are regulations about environmental impact, noise pollution, and aesthetic standards that haven't been enforced as strictly as they should be. Sometimes it takes proper oversight to help business owners understand their responsibilities to the community." Marcus stepped outside, no longer content to eavesdrop on a conversation about his livelihood. The group fell silent as they noticed him approaching, taking in his oil-stained coveralls and the grease under his fingernails. He could see the judgment in their eyes, the automatic assumption that his appearance reflected his character and capabilities. "Good morning," Marcus said politely, addressing the group. "I couldn't help but overhear your discussion. Is there something I can help clarify about my shop or its operations?" Victoria's smile became even more artificial as she turned to face him. "Mr. Thompson, how convenient. We were just discussing the neighborhood's development goals and how various businesses fit into our vision for the future." "I see," Marcus replied, maintaining his calm despite the obvious implications. "And what concerns do you have about my business specifically?" "Well, there are several issues," Victoria began, pulling out a tablet and scrolling through what appeared to be a prepared list. "Environmental compliance, for one. The disposal of automotive fluids and waste materials requires strict adherence to EPA guidelines. Then there's the matter of noise levels during business hours, and of course the overall appearance of the property." Marcus felt his jaw clench but kept his voice steady. "I follow all environmental regulations and have regular inspections to ensure compliance. My waste disposal company picks up materials weekly, and I have all the required certifications. As for noise, I operate within standard business hours and have never received a formal complaint." "Perhaps not formal complaints," Victoria conceded, "but several residents have expressed concerns about the impact your business has on property values and the general atmosphere of the neighborhood." George Patterson stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Marcus runs an honest business that provides a valuable service. Half the people in this neighborhood have had their cars fixed at this shop at one time or another." "That may be true," Victoria replied smoothly, "but times change and communities evolve. We have to ask ourselves whether every business that exists today is the best fit for tomorrow's vision." Marcus looked around at the faces surrounding him. Some seemed sympathetic to his position, while others appeared to agree with Victoria's assessment. He recognized the divide that had been growing in the neighborhood for years between those who valued its working-class roots and those who wanted to transform it into something entirely different. "What exactly are you proposing?" Marcus asked directly. Victoria's eyes lit up with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. "Well, since you ask, I've been working with the city planning department on a comprehensive redevelopment plan for this block. We envision a mixed-use complex with retail space, professional offices, and upscale residential units. It would bring significant investment to the area and create a more cohesive architectural aesthetic." "And where does my shop fit into this vision?" Marcus asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Unfortunately, automotive repair facilities don't align with the intended use profile," Victoria admitted with mock regret. "However, I'd be prepared to offer you a fair price for your property, significantly more than market value for a business in its current condition." The offer was clearly meant to sound generous, but Marcus heard the underlying threat. This wasn't really a negotiation, It was a notice that his time in the neighborhood was coming to an end, whether he wanted it or not. The only question was whether he would go quietly or make things difficult for everyone involved. "I appreciate your offer," Marcus said carefully, "but this shop has been in my family for 40 years. It's not just a business, it's my heritage and my livelihood. I'm not interested in selling." Victoria's friendly mask slipped slightly, revealing the steel underneath. "That's certainly your right, Mr. Thompson. I just hope you'll keep an open mind as the neighborhood continues to evolve. Sometimes change is inevitable regardless of our personal preferences." The group began to disperse after this exchange, with Victoria making appointments to meet privately with other business owners on the. Marcus watched them go, feeling a growing sense of unease about what the future might hold. He had always known that gentrification was a double-edged sword, bringing investment and improvements, but often displacing the very people and businesses that had made a neighborhood worth improving in the first place. Over the next few days, Marcus noticed subtle changes in how some of his customers treated him. Appointments were canceled without explanation, and several regular clients mentioned that they were taking their business elsewhere. The businessman with the BMW returned with another minor issue, but spent the entire time questioning every aspect of Marcus's work and complaining about having to visit such an unprofessional establishment. The pressure campaign was clearly underway, though it was conducted with the kind of polite ruthlessness that made it difficult to directly challenge. Marcus began documenting everything, keeping detailed records of his compliance with all regulations, photographing the condition of his property, and saving any communications that might be relevant if legal action became necessary. One afternoon, while Marcus was replacing brake pads on Mrs. Rodriguez's truck, she mentioned that she had been approached by someone asking questions about the shop's operations. The woman had identified herself as being from the city planning office and had inquired about noise levels, customer complaints, and general neighborhood satisfaction with automotive businesses. "I told her you've always been nothing but professional and helpful," Mrs. Rodriguez assured him. But she seemed to have her mind made up already. "Keep asking leading questions like she was trying to get me to say something negative." Marcus thanked her for the warning and made a mental note to contact the city planning office directly to understand what kind of investigation might be underway. He had nothing to hide, but experience had taught him that bureaucratic processes could be manipulated by those who understood the system better than he did. The following week brought his first official notice from the city. An inspector would be conducting a comprehensive review of his business operations, including environmental compliance, zoning adherence, and safety protocols. The inspection was scheduled for the following Friday, giving Marcus just enough time to prepare but not enough time to address any major issues if they arose. Marcus spent the intervening days reviewing every aspect of his operation. He organized his documentation, cleaned and organized his workspace even more thoroughly than usual, and contacted his waste disposal company to confirm that all pickup schedules were current and properly documented. He also reached out to other business owners in the area to understand if they were facing similar scrutiny. The response was mixed. Established businesses that fit Victoria Sterling's vision for the neighborhood reported no unusual attention from city officials. However, several working-class establishments were experiencing increased oversight, suggesting that the inspection campaign was targeted rather than random. On the day of the inspection, Marcus arrived early to make sure everything was perfect. The inspector, a stern-faced woman in her 50s named Patricia Webb, arrived precisely on time with a clipboard full of forms and a camera for documentation. She was professional but distant, making it clear that this was strictly business rather than a friendly visit. The inspection was thorough and lasted nearly 3 hours. Inspector Webb examined every inch of the shop, questioned Marcus about his procedures, and photographed anything that might be considered irregular. She paid particular attention to areas where oil or other automotive fluids might have stained the concrete. Despite Marcus's explanation that such staining was normal in any automotive facility, and that he used absorbent materials to prevent environmental contamination. "Mr. Thompson," Inspector Webb said as she completed her documentation, "I'll be submitting my report to the planning department within the next week. You'll receive a copy of any findings along with information about required remediation steps, if any." "Is there anything specific I should be concerned about?" Marcus asked, trying to gauge how the inspection had gone. Inspector Webb's expression remained neutral. "I document what I observe and let the department make determinations about compliance. You'll hear from them directly if any action is required. After she left, Marcus felt drained and anxious. The inspection had been professional, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Inspector Webb had been looking for problems rather than simply verifying compliance. Small issues that might normally be overlooked seemed to receive extra attention and documentation. That evening, as Marcus was closing up the shop, he noticed a familiar figure standing across the street. Commander Hayes was leaning against his car, apparently waiting for the right moment to approach. When he saw that the shop was empty except for Marcus, the commander crossed the street with a purposeful stride. "Marcus, good to see you again," Commander Hayes said, extending his hand. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced." "Not at all, Commander. What brings you to this part of town?" "Actually, I've been in the area quite a bit lately," Hayes replied. "I heard through some channels that you might be dealing with some challenges related to your business." Marcus was surprised by the comment. He hadn't mentioned his troubles to anyone outside his immediate circle, and he certainly hadn't expected word to reach someone like Commander Hayes. "I'm curious how you heard about that," Marcus said carefully. Hayes smiled. "The military community is smaller than you might think, and we tend to look out for people who have shown us kindness. When I mentioned your help with my car to some colleagues, one of them mentioned that he'd heard about pressure being put on local businesses in this area. It wasn't hard to put two and two together." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another car, so the gesture that's present was he who had no. Victoria Sterling stepped out of a sleek black sedan, her expression showing surprise and displeasure at finding Commander Hayes at the shop. She approached with her usual confident stride, but Marcus noticed a subtle change in her demeanor when she took in the commander's military bearing and insignia. "Mr. Dessau. Thompson," Victoria said, nodding politely to both men. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," Marcus replied. "Miss Sterling, this is Commander Hayes. Commander, Victoria Sterling. She's a local developer." The two shook hands briefly, and Marcus could sense an immediate tension between them. Victoria's usual commanding presence seemed diminished in the face of Commander Hayes's quiet authority, while the commander's assessment of Victoria was clearly unfavorable based on what he had likely heard about the pressure campaign against local businesses. "I was just stopping by to follow up on our previous conversation," Victoria said, directing her attention back to Marcus. "I wanted to make sure you had time to consider my offer and to let you know that the timeline for our project has been accelerated somewhat." "Accelerated how?" Marcus asked. "Well, we've received approval to move forward with the planning phase more quickly than anticipated," Victoria explained. "Which means we'll need to finalize property acquisitions within the next few months rather than next year." Commander Hayes had remained silent during this exchange, but Marcus could see that he was listening intently to every word. The commander's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his posture that suggested he was evaluating Victoria and finding her wanting. "As I mentioned before," Marcus said firmly, "I'm not interested in selling. This business means everything to me and my family." Victoria's smile became strained. "I understand your attachment, Mr. Thompson, but sometimes we have to be realistic about changing circumstances. The city inspection you had today is just the beginning of increased scrutiny that older businesses can expect as the neighborhood transforms." The comment was clearly meant as a veiled threat, and Marcus felt his anger rising. Before he could respond, however, Commander Hayes spoke for the first time since the introductions. "Ms. Sterling," the commander said quietly, "are you suggesting that city inspections are being used to pressure specific businesses into selling their properties?" Victoria's composure slipped slightly at the directness of the question. "Of course not, Commander. I'm simply pointing out that regulatory compliance will be increasingly important as the neighborhood attracts more upscale businesses and residents." "I see," Hayes replied. "And who exactly is driving this transformation? The community itself, or outside developers looking to maximize their investment returns?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria clearly wasn't accustomed to being questioned so directly, especially by someone whose authority she couldn't dismiss or intimidate. Marcus watched the exchange with fascination, seeing his situation through the eyes of someone trained to recognize strategic manipulation and abuse of power. "Community development is always a collaborative process," Victoria said carefully. "We work closely with city planning and local stakeholders to ensure that changes benefit everyone involved." Everyone? Commander Hayes asked. Including the people and businesses that have been part of this community for generations? Victoria's facade of friendliness finally cracked completely. Commander, I'm sure your intentions are good, but you may not fully understand the complexities of urban development and economic growth. Sometimes progress requires difficult decisions. Ma'am, Hayes replied with military formality. I understand exactly what I'm looking at. I've seen this same pattern in communities around the world. Powerful interests, using bureaucratic pressure and economic intimidation to displace people who can't fight back. It's textbook predatory development. The accusation was serious and direct, leaving Victoria momentarily speechless. Marcus could see that she was recalculating her approach, trying to determine how much influence Commander Hayes might have and whether he posed a real threat to her plans. I think there may be some misunderstanding about our goals and methods, Victoria said finally. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting to discuss the project in more detail. I'm confident that any concerns can be addressed through proper channels. That won't be necessary, Hayes replied. I have all the information I need to understand what's happening here. Victoria looked between the two men, clearly frustrated by this unexpected complication in what had been a straightforward acquisition campaign. After a moment's hesitation, she decided to cut her losses and retreat, at least temporarily. Well, I'll leave you gentlemen to your conversation, she said with forced pleasantness. Mr. Thompson, my offer remains open, but as I mentioned, time is becoming a factor. After Victoria's car disappeared around the corner, Marcus turned to Commander Hayes with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. The commander's intervention had been unexpected but clearly effective in demonstrating that Marcus wasn't as isolated as his opponents might have believed. Thank you for that, Marcus said. I'm not sure why you got involved, but I appreciate the support. Hayes was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider his words carefully. Marcus, I've spent my career fighting to protect people's rights and freedoms. When I see those same rights being threatened at home, it bothers me more than you can imagine. The simple statement carried more weight than any grand speech could have. Marcus understood that Commander Hayes saw his situation not just as a local business dispute, but as part of a larger pattern of injustice that demanded response from anyone with the power to act. As the evening shadows lengthened, the two men talked about the challenges facing the neighborhood and the broader issues of economic displacement and community preservation. Marcus gained new perspective on his situation, understanding that what he was experiencing was neither unique nor insurmountable if approached with the right strategy and support. When Commander Hayes finally left, he made it clear that Marcus could count on his continued involvement if the situation escalated. The business card that Marcus had tucked away weeks earlier suddenly seemed much more significant, representing not just a contact, but a genuine ally in what was shaping up to be a difficult fight for his livelihood and his family's legacy. The inspection report arrived on a Monday morning, delivered by certified mail with an official city seal that made Marcus's hands shake as he signed for the envelope. He waited until he was alone in his shop before opening it, somehow knowing that whatever was inside would change everything he had worked to build. The document was 15 pages long, filled with technical language and regulatory citations that took Marcus several readings to fully comprehend. Inspector Webb had been thorough in her documentation, noting dozens of minor issues that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively painted a picture of a business operating outside acceptable standards. The violations ranged from excessive concrete staining due to inadequate containment procedures to non-compliance with noise mitigation requirements during peak business hours. Several items addressed environmental concerns about groundwater contamination risks, despite Marcus having passed similar inspections for years without incident. Most troubling were the citations for aesthetic maintenance standards and community impact considerations, vague categories that seemed designed to give officials maximum discretion in enforcement decisions. Marcus read through the required remediation steps with growing dismay. The city was demanding a complete environmental assessment of his property at his own expense, installation of new containment systems for all automotive fluids, soundproofing modifications to reduce noise levels, and a comprehensive exterior renovation to bring the building into compliance with new neighborhood character standards. The estimated cost for all required improvements was listed at over $200,000, more than 3 times what Marcus earned in a good year and far beyond his financial capabilities. The deadline for compliance was set at 90 days, with daily fines beginning immediately for any violations not addressed within 30 days. As Marcus absorbed the implications of the report, he felt a mixture of rage and despair that threatened to overwhelm him. This wasn't about legitimate regulatory compliance. It was economic warfare designed to force him out of business through financial pressure he couldn't possibly meet. The timing and scope of the demands made it clear that someone with significant influence had orchestrated this assault on his livelihood. The phone rang, interrupting his dark thoughts. Rodriguez was calling to schedule routine maintenance for her truck, but her voice carried an unusual note of concern. "Marcus, mijo, I heard from my neighbor that inspectors have been asking questions about your shop around the neighborhood," she said. "They came to my door yesterday asking if I'd ever noticed environmental problems or been bothered by noise from your business." "What did you tell them?" Marcus asked. "I told them the truth, that you've always been professional, and that I've never had any problems with your work or your business," she replied firmly. But they kept pushing, asking leading questions like they wanted me to complain about something. It felt wrong, like they were trying to build a case against you. Marcus thanked her for the warning and the loyalty, but the conversation confirmed his suspicions that the inspection had been just the beginning of a coordinated campaign. If city officials were conducting neighborhood surveys to gather complaints about his business, it meant someone was preparing for a legal challenge that would be difficult to defend against, especially with limited resources. Over the next few days, Marcus reached out to other business owners who had faced similar pressure. The pattern was consistent: targeted inspections followed by impossible remediation requirements, combined with door-to-door surveys designed to generate community opposition. Several businesses had already closed rather than fight the system, while others had sold their properties to Victoria Sterling's development company at below-market prices. The pressure wasn't just bureaucratic, it was social and economic as well. Marcus noticed that longtime customers were becoming scarce, replaced by hostile encounters with people who seemed to view his continued presence in the neighborhood as a personal affront. Anonymous complaints to the city increased daily, covering everything from alleged safety violations to claims that his business attracted undesirable elements to the area. On Thursday evening, as Marcus was struggling through financial projections that all pointed toward bankruptcy, Commander Hayes appeared at his shop door. The commander's expression was grim, suggesting he was aware of recent developments and wasn't bringing good news. "I heard about the inspection report," Hayes said without preamble. 200,000 in required improvements with a 90-day deadline is clearly designed to force you out of business. Marcus nodded wearily. "I've been trying to figure out some way to fight this, but I don't have the money for lawyers or environmental consultants. Even if I could prove the requirements are unreasonable, I can't afford to comply while I'm fighting them in court." Commander Hayes walked around the shop, examining the areas that had been cited in the inspection report. His assessment was methodical and professional, the evaluation of someone trained to understand both technical requirements and strategic manipulation. "The violations they've cited are mostly subjective or based on standards that have never been consistently enforced," Hayes observed. "This concrete staining is normal for any automotive facility, and your waste disposal procedures are actually better than most shops I've seen. Someone is using regulatory harassment to achieve what they couldn't accomplish through normal business pressure." "That's what I figured," Marcus replied. "But knowing they're wrong doesn't help if I can't prove it, or afford to fight them." Hayes was quiet for several minutes, apparently weighing different options in his mind. When he spoke again, his tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions under pressure. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Are you willing to fight this publicly, knowing that it might get messy and that there could be retaliation against you and your business?" The question caught Marcus off guard. He had been thinking in terms of compliance or closure, not public confrontation with powerful interests that clearly had the resources to destroy him if they chose to focus their attention on the effort. "What did you have in mind?" Marcus asked cautiously. "I have contacts in investigative journalism and political oversight," Hayes explained. "This pattern of predatory development using regulatory harassment is a story that needs to be told, and your situation could be the case study that exposes the whole system. But it would mean putting yourself at the center of a very public fight with people who have a lot to lose if their methods are exposed." Marcus considered the proposal, weighing his limited options against the risks of taking on opponents with vastly superior resources. The status quo was already unsustainable, leading inevitably to the loss of his business and his family's legacy. Fighting back might accelerate the timeline of his destruction, but it also offered the only realistic chance of survival. "If I do this," Marcus asked, "what kind of support can I expect? I can't fight Victoria Sterling and the city planning department with just my own resources." "You won't be alone," Hayes assured him. "I've been making some calls since our last conversation, and there are people in positions of influence who are concerned about what's happening in neighborhoods like this one. The military community has a strong interest in protecting the rights of working people, especially those who have shown support for service members." The reference to their first encounter made Marcus smile despite his circumstances. His simple act of helping a stranded motorist had created a network of support that he never could have imagined. The commander's interest went beyond personal gratitude to encompass principles of justice and community protection that resonated with military values. "What would be the first step?" Marcus asked. Hayes pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. "I'm going to put you in touch with Sarah Chen, an investigative reporter who specializes in urban development issues. She's been looking for a case that illustrates the human cost of gentrification, and your situation fits perfectly. She'll want to document everything: the inspection, the neighborhood surveys, the pattern of pressure on other businesses. And then what? Then we make sure the story gets the attention it deserves." Hayes replied, "I have contacts in congressional offices, military advocacy groups, and veterans organizations who understand the importance of protecting working communities. When this story breaks, it won't be just local news, it'll be a national conversation about economic bullying and abuse of regulatory authority." Marcus felt a surge of hope for the first time in weeks. The prospect of fighting back instead of simply enduring was energizing, even if the outcome remained uncertain. At minimum, he would go down fighting rather than being slowly strangled by bureaucratic manipulation. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Victoria Sterling arrived at the shop with two men in expensive suits who introduced themselves as attorneys representing her development company. Their presence was clearly meant to be intimidating, and their message was direct. Marcus had until the end of the week to accept their purchase offer or face legal action for the violations cited in the inspection report. "The city has authority to condemn properties that pose environmental or public safety risks," one of the lawyers explained with clinical detachment. "Rather than putting yourself through an expensive legal battle you can't win, why not accept our generous offer and move on with your life?" Marcus looked at the three of them standing in his shop, representing everything that was wrong with how power operated in his community. These people had never worked with their hands, never built anything lasting, never contributed to the fabric of neighborhood life, yet they had the resources and connections to destroy what he had spent his life creating. "I'm not interested in selling," Marcus said firmly. "This business stays in my family." Victoria's expression hardened. "Mr. Burks, Thompson, I've tried to be reasonable with you, but you're forcing us to take a more aggressive approach. The environmental violations alone could result in criminal charges if the contamination is serious enough. Is protecting your pride really worth risking your freedom?" The threat was clear and serious. Environmental violations could indeed result in criminal liability, especially if prosecutors chose to interpret the evidence in the most negative possible light. Marcus was beginning to understand the full scope of what he was up against. Not just civil regulatory action, but potential criminal prosecution for activities that had been considered normal business practice for decades. After the lawyers left, Marcus called Commander Hayes to report the escalation. The commander's response was swift and decisive. "They've overplayed their hand," Hayes said. "Threatening criminal prosecution for standard automotive repair activities shows how desperate they're becoming. Sarah Chen is going to want to hear about this immediately." Within hours, Marcus found himself sitting across from a young woman whose intensity and intelligence were immediately apparent. Sarah Chen was clearly someone who approached journalism as a form of warfare against injustice, and she saw in Marcus's situation the kind of systemic abuse that demanded exposure and accountability. The interview lasted 3 hours, with Chen documenting every aspect of the pressure campaign against Marcus and other local businesses. She was particularly interested in the coordination between Victoria Sterling's development company and the city planning department, noting patterns that suggested inappropriate collaboration between private interests and public officials. "This is bigger than just your shop," Chen explained to Marcus. What you're experiencing is happening in working-class neighborhoods across the country. Developers use regulatory harassment to force out existing businesses, then claim community support for their projects because the opposition has been systematically eliminated. Chen's investigation revealed a network of relationships between Sterling Development, city planning officials, and political figures that raise serious questions about conflicts of interest and abuse of authority. The environmental violations cited against Marcus appeared to be based on standards that had never been applied to other businesses, while the required remediation steps went far beyond normal compliance measures. More damaging was Chen's discovery that several properties acquired by Sterling Development had been subject to similar regulatory pressure, suggesting a pattern of behavior that might constitute organized economic coercion. The story she was preparing would expose not just individual wrongdoing, but systematic corruption that extended to the highest levels of local government. As the investigation deepened, Marcus found himself at the center of a growing controversy that attracted attention far beyond his neighborhood. Veterans organizations, small business advocacy groups, and community rights activists began rallying to his cause, understanding that his fight represented broader issues of economic justice and community preservation. The pressure campaign against Marcus intensified in response to the growing public attention. Anonymous complaints to city agencies multiplied daily. His shop was vandalized repeatedly, and several customers reported being approached by people claiming to represent health or safety agencies, warning them away from his business. But for the first time since receiving the inspection report, Marcus felt that he might actually win this fight. The support network that had emerged around his case was formidable, and the publicity was beginning to expose the tactics being used against him and other small business owners. The battle was far from over, but Marcus was no longer fighting alone. Commander Hayes had kept his promise, transforming a simple act of kindness into a powerful alliance for justice that would determine not just Marcus's fate, but the future of his entire community. Sarah Chen's article appeared on the front page of the San Diego Tribune on a Tuesday morning, accompanied by a photograph of Marcus standing in front of his shop with his arms crossed, defiant despite the overwhelming odds stacked against him. The headline read, "The War on Working Communities: How Developers Use City Hall to Eliminate Competition." The story was devastating in its thoroughness and precision. Chen had documented not only Marcus's case, but similar situations affecting dozens of small businesses across the city. She exposed the relationships between Sterling Development and key city officials, revealed email communications discussing strategies to pressure property owners into selling, and provided evidence of selective enforcement of regulations based on development priorities rather than legitimate public safety concerns. Within hours of publication, Marcus's shop was surrounded by news crews seeking follow-up interviews. Local television stations picked up the story, and by evening it had been shared thousands of times on social media platforms. The public response was immediate and overwhelmingly supportive, with people expressing outrage at the systematic abuse of regulatory authority for private profit. The reaction from Sterling Development was swift and aggressive. Victoria Sterling held a hastily organized press conference, denying all allegations and threatening legal action against both the newspaper and Marcus for what she termed defamatory attacks on legitimate business practices. Her lawyers issued statements characterizing the investigation as biased journalism designed to obstruct necessary community improvements. But the damage to Sterling's reputation was significant and growing. City council members began distancing themselves from the development company, and several officials mentioned in Chen's article announced they were taking temporary leave pending internal investigations. The mayor's office issued a statement promising a comprehensive review of city inspection and enforcement practices. Marcus found himself transformed overnight, from an unknown mechanic into a symbol of resistance against economic bullying. Letters of support poured in from across the country, along with small donations from people who wanted to help him fight the required remediation costs. Several lawyers offered to represent him pro bono, and environmental consultants volunteered their services to challenge the inspection findings. Commander Hayes coordinated much of this support, connecting Marcus with resources and expertise that would have been impossible to access on his own. The commander's military network proved invaluable, bringing together people with diverse skills and connections who understood the importance of protecting working communities from predatory development. The legal battle intensified as Sterling Development filed suit against Marcus for alleged defamation, while simultaneously pursuing city enforcement of the environmental violations. Their strategy seemed designed to overwhelm Marcus with legal costs and force him into bankruptcy regardless of the merits of his case, but the public attention had changed the dynamics of the conflict. The city planning department, previously cooperative with Sterling's goals, found itself under intense scrutiny from both media and political oversight. Inspector Webb was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into her inspection practices, and several other officials were reassigned to different departments. Marcus's day-to-day life became a surreal mixture of normal automotive repair work and constant media attention. He continued serving his regular customers while giving interviews to journalists and meeting with lawyers about legal strategy. The contrast between his grease-stained work clothes and the sophisticated legal and media campaign surrounding his case seemed to embody the broader conflict between working-class values and corporate power. The environmental assessment required by the city inspection revealed what many had suspected. There were no significant contamination issues at Marcus's property. The independent consultants hired with donated funds found that soil and groundwater quality met all applicable standards, and that the concrete staining cited in the original inspection posed no environmental risks. This vindication should have ended the regulatory pressure. But Sterling Development's lawyers argued that the violations were still valid based on preventive environmental protection standards and aesthetic requirements that had never been clearly defined or consistently applied. The legal maneuvering became increasingly desperate as their original justifications collapsed under scrutiny. Meanwhile, Sarah Chen continued her investigation, uncovering additional evidence of coordination between Sterling Development and city officials. Email records obtained through public information requests revealed discussions about using regulatory pressure to encourage property sales, and meeting notes that explicitly discussed targeting specific businesses for increased enforcement. The most damaging revelation was a recorded conversation between Victoria Sterling and a city planning official discussing how to structure violation notices to maximize financial pressure on property owners. The recording, made by a whistleblower within the planning department, captured Sterling laughing about breaking these people financially and joking about how small business owners never see it coming until it's too late. The public release of this recording marked the turning point in the conflict. Sterling Development's stock price plummeted as investors abandoned a company associated with corruption and abuse of public authority. Several government contracts were canceled, and the development project that had started the whole controversy was suspended pending investigation. Victoria Sterling herself became the subject of criminal investigation for conspiracy to violate civil rights and abuse of public office. The U.S. Attorney's Office announced that it was reviewing the case for potential federal prosecution under laws designed to protect citizens from official misconduct and economic coercion. Marcus watched these developments with a mixture of satisfaction and amazement. The simple act of refusing to be intimidated had triggered a cascade of consequences that went far beyond his own situation. Other small business owners who had been pressured into selling their properties came forward with their stories, and a pattern of systematic abuse became undeniable. The financial support from the community allowed Marcus not only to fight the legal battles but to make genuine improvements to his shop. He installed new environmental protection systems that exceeded regulatory requirements, updated his equipment, and even hired an additional mechanic to handle the increased business that resulted from all the publicity. But the most meaningful changes were personal and community-based. Marcus found himself connected to a network of people who shared his values and commitment to protecting working communities. Regular customers who had been intimidated into staying away returned with renewed loyalty, and new customers sought him out specifically because of his stand against corporate bullying. Commander Hayes became not just an ally but a genuine friend, stopping by the shop regularly to check on Marcus's progress and to coordinate ongoing advocacy efforts. Their relationship illustrated how shared principles could bridge differences in background and social position, creating bonds that transcended normal social boundaries. The legal resolution came gradually, rather than through dramatic courtroom confrontations. Faced with overwhelming evidence of misconduct and growing criminal exposure, Sterling Development quietly withdrew its lawsuits against Marcus and agreed to a consent decree that prevented future harassment of small businesses. Victoria Sterling resigned from the company and left San Diego, reportedly relocating to another state where her reputation hadn't yet caught up with her. The city settled Marcus's claims against the planning department for a substantial sum that more than covered his legal costs and provided resources for shop improvements. More importantly, the settlement included policy changes that established clear standards for business inspections and created oversight mechanisms to prevent future abuse of regulatory authority. Inspector Webb was fired after the internal investigation revealed that she had selectively enforced regulations based on guidance from Sterling Development representatives. Several other city employees faced disciplinary action, and the planning department underwent comprehensive reforms designed to prevent similar corruption in the future. As the immediate crisis subsided, Marcus began to appreciate the broader impact of his decision to fight rather than surrender. The precedent established by his case provided protection for other small business owners facing similar pressure, and the publicity had educated the public about predatory development tactics that thrived in darkness and secrecy. Sarah Chen won a regional journalism award for her investigation, and her follow-up stories documented the recovery and revitalization of the neighborhood as small businesses that had been driven out began to return. The diversity and authenticity that Victoria Sterling had tried to eliminate proved to be exactly what made the area attractive to residents and visitors. Marcus's shop became something of a local landmark, visited not just by customers but by people who wanted to see where the little guy had stood up to the system and won. He kept the newspaper clipping about his case framed on the wall, not as a monument to his own courage, but as a reminder that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences when they refused to accept injustice. The relationship with Commander Hayes continued to deepen, evolving into a friendship that enriched both their lives. The commander brought military friends to the shop for vehicle maintenance, and Marcus began attending veterans events as a civilian supporter. Their bond illustrated how genuine human connections could form around shared values regardless of different backgrounds and experiences. As Marcus reflected on everything that had happened, he realized that the crisis had revealed both the worst and best aspects of human nature. The greed and corruption that had threatened his livelihood existed alongside generosity and courage that had saved it. The difference had been the willingness of good people to act when action was necessary, rather than standing by while injustice flourished. The neighborhood around his shop continued to evolve, but now the changes reflected community needs and desires rather than external manipulation. New businesses opened that complemented rather than replaced existing establishments, and property values increased in a way that benefited longtime residents instead of driving them away. Marcus understood that his victory was both personal and symbolic, representing the possibility that working people could successfully resist economic pressure when they had community support and refused to fight alone. The lesson had implications far beyond his own situation, offering hope to others facing similar challenges across the country. But perhaps most importantly, the experience had confirmed his faith in the fundamental decency of most people. When confronted with clear evidence of injustice, the community had rallied to support him despite his humble position and unremarkable appearance. The grease-stained mechanic had been judged by his character rather than his social status, and that judgment had been overwhelmingly positive. The business card that Commander Hayes had given him months earlier remained in Marcus's wallet, no longer as a curiosity but as a reminder of how unexpected connections could change everything. A simple act of kindness had grown into a powerful alliance that had transformed not just his own life, but the entire community around him. 2 years had passed since Marcus Thompson's confrontation with Sterling Development became national news, and the auto repair shop that had once been threatened with closure now stood as a symbol of successful resistance against corporate intimidation. The building bore fresh paint and colors that honored its industrial heritage while meeting modern aesthetic standards, and the business inside had grown beyond anything Marcus had imagined possible. The shop employed 4 full-time mechanics and an office manager, serving not only neighborhood residents but customers from across the city who sought out Marcus's services specifically because of his reputation for integrity and quality work. The publicity from his legal battle had attracted attention from automotive enthusiasts, military personnel, and people who simply wanted to support a business that had stood up to bullying. Marcus himself had evolved from a local mechanic into an inadvertent advocate for small business rights and community preservation. He spoke regularly at conferences about predatory development practices, testified before legislative committees considering reforms to regulatory oversight, and consulted with other communities facing similar pressures. Yet he remained grounded in his fundamental identity as someone who fixed things and helped people solve problems. The neighborhood around the shop had undergone its own transformation, but one that reflected organic community growth rather than externally imposed gentrification. New businesses had opened that complemented the existing character of the area. A coffee roastery run by a veteran, a bookstore specializing in working-class history, and a restaurant serving food from the diverse cultures represented in the community. Property values had indeed increased, but longtime residents benefited from the appreciation rather than being displaced by it. The attention brought by Marcus's case had attracted residents who valued authenticity and community connection over superficial luxury, creating a neighborhood that was economically healthy without losing its soul. Commander Hayes had become not just a friend but a business partner of sorts, helping Marcus establish a nonprofit foundation that provided legal assistance to small businesses facing regulatory harassment. The foundation, funded by donations and grants from organizations sympathetic to their cause, had already helped dozens of business owners fight similar pressure campaigns across the region. The morning routine at Thompson Auto Repair now included reviewing requests for assistance from businesses in other communities, alongside the traditional work of diagnosing engine problems and replacing brake pads. Marcus had learned to balance his expanded responsibilities with his core mission of serving customers who depended on his mechanical expertise. On this particular Tuesday, as Marcus was reviewing invoices in his newly organized office, Mrs. Rodriguez arrived for her quarterly maintenance appointment. Her truck, now nearly 15 years old, continued to run smoothly thanks to Marcus's careful attention and her commitment to regular service. Their relationship represented everything positive about community-based business: mutual respect, long-term loyalty, and shared investment in each other's success. "Marcus, mijo," she said as he emerged from the office to greet her. "I saw you on the television news again last night. They were talking about that law you helped get passed in Sacramento." Marcus smiled, still somewhat embarrassed by the media attention that continued to follow his advocacy work. The legislation she referenced would prevent local governments from using selective regulatory enforcement to pressure businesses into selling their properties, establishing clear guidelines for inspections and appeals processes that protected property owners from abuse. It was a team effort. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I just told my story to help people understand why those protections are necessary." "Don't be modest," she replied firmly. "You stood up when you could have just walked away, and now other people won't have to go through what you went through. Your grandfather would be proud of what you've done with this place." The mention of his grandfather brought Marcus a moment of reflection. The old man had built this business on principles of honest work and community service, never imagining that those values would one day become the foundation for a broader movement for economic justice. Marcus felt the weight of that legacy and the responsibility to honor it through continued service to others. The afternoon brought a familiar sound, a car engine in distress pulling into the parking area outside the shop. Marcus looked through the window to see a young woman in military uniform, standing beside a smoking sedan, her expression mixing frustration with resignation at finding herself stranded far from base. Without hesitation, Marcus grabbed his diagnostic equipment and headed outside. The scene reminded him vividly of his first encounter with Commander Hayes, and he wondered if this moment might prove equally significant in ways he couldn't yet imagine. "Looks like you're having some trouble," Marcus said as he approached the service member. "I'm Marcus Thompson. This is my shop. Mind if I take a look?" The young woman's face lit up with relief. "Sergeant Lisa Martinez, sir. I was driving back to base when the engine just started overheating. I'm supposed to report for duty in 3 hours, and I have no idea what's wrong." Marcus lifted the hood and immediately identified a familiar problem: a failed water pump that had caused the engine to overheat. It was a straightforward repair that would take about 2 hours, well within the time frame Sergeant Martinez needed to meet her obligation. "Good news and bad news," Marcus explained. "The good news is it's just a water pump which I can fix today. The bad news is it'll take a couple hours, so you might be cutting it close getting back to base." Sergeant Martinez's shoulders sagged. "I can't afford to be late for duty, but I also can't afford to abandon my car. This is my only transportation, and I need it to get to work every day." Marcus recognized the familiar struggle of military personnel trying to maintain aging vehicles on limited budgets. Commander Hayes had educated him about the challenges faced by enlisted service members, who often earned less than civilian mechanics while carrying enormous responsibilities for national defense. "Tell you what," Marcus said, "let me call your commanding officer and explain the situation." Most military leaders understand that vehicle problems are legitimate reasons for delay, especially when you're making good faith efforts to resolve them quickly. The phone call to the base resulted in Sergeant Martinez receiving permission to report for duty the following morning, provided she could document that her car was being professionally repaired. Marcus provided the necessary paperwork and began work on the water pump replacement, noting that the vehicle showed signs of deferred maintenance that suggested financial constraints. As he worked, Sergeant Martinez explained that she was a single mother supporting 2 young children while serving in the Marine Corps. The car represented not just transportation, but her connection to economic stability and her ability to fulfill her military obligations. A breakdown like this could cascade into missed duty, disciplinary action, and potentially the end of her military career. Marcus completed the repair in just over an hour, working with the efficiency that came from years of experience and genuine desire to help someone in need. When he presented the bill, he had included only the cost of parts, waiving his normal labor charges in recognition of Sergeant Martinez's service and financial situation. "Sir, I can't accept charity," she protested. "You've already gone above and beyond by calling my command and working so quickly. Please let me pay you properly for your time." Marcus understood the pride that motivated her objection, having felt similar reactions when others tried to help him during his own struggles. "Sergeant, this isn't charity, it's community. When I needed help fighting for my business, the military community stood with me. Now I have a chance to return that support." The explanation seemed to make the gesture more acceptable to her, and she agreed to pay only for the parts while promising to refer other military personnel to the shop. As she prepared to leave, Sergeant Martinez mentioned that she had heard about Marcus's case from other service members, who spoke of him with admiration and respect. "What you did took real courage," she said. "Standing up to those developers when you could have just taken their money and walked away. That's the kind of integrity we try to instill in young Marines." After Sergeant Martinez left, Marcus reflected on how his perspective on success and purpose had evolved. 2 years earlier, he had measured his achievements by the number of cars repaired and bills paid. Now he understood that his most important work involved building connections between people and creating opportunities for others to succeed. The shop had become more than a business. It was a community hub where people from different backgrounds found common ground around shared values of hard work, mutual support, and resistance to injustice. Veterans, longtime residents, small business owners, and newcomers to the neighborhood all gathered there, drawn by the atmosphere of acceptance and the example of someone who had fought for principle rather than profit. Commander Hayes arrived as Marcus was closing the shop for the day, bringing with him a young Navy officer who was interested in learning about the Foundation's work with small businesses. The 3 men spent the evening discussing strategies for expanding their advocacy efforts and planning a conference that would bring together business owners, military advocates, and community organizers from across the country. "You know," Commander Hayes observed as they reviewed their plans, "when I broke down in front of your shop 2 years ago, I thought I was just having car trouble." I had no idea I was witnessing the beginning of a movement. Marcus smiled at the memory. "I was just trying to help a neighbor in need. Everything else grew out of that simple decision." "That's exactly the point," the commander replied. "Real change doesn't usually come from grand gestures or elaborate plans. It comes from ordinary people doing the right thing when the moment demands it, then building on those small acts of decency until they become something powerful." The conversation continued late into the evening, encompassing topics from military-civilian relations to economic justice to the importance of preserving community identity in an era of rapid change. Marcus found himself energized by the discussion, grateful for the intellectual stimulation that had become part of his expanded role as an advocate and organizer. As his guests prepared to leave, Marcus walked through the shop one final time, checking that everything was secure for the night. The familiar smell of motor oil and the sight of tomorrow's projects waiting for attention grounded him in the reality of his primary calling. No matter how much his public profile had grown, he remained fundamentally a mechanic who took pride in solving problems and helping people get where they needed to go. The business card Commander Hayes had given him still resided in his wallet, now joined by dozens of others from lawyers, journalists, politicians, and activists who had become part of his expanding network. But that original card retained special significance as the symbol of how unexpected connections could transform lives and communities. Standing in his shop as the evening shadows lengthened, Marcus Thompson understood that he had become living proof of an essential American principle, that ordinary people who refuse to accept injustice can achieve extraordinary things. His grease-stained coveralls and calloused hands had not prevented him from taking on powerful opponents and winning, demonstrating that character mattered more than social status in the battles that really counted. The neighborhood around him buzzed with the energy of authentic community life, where people knew each other's names and looked out for each other's interests. Property values had risen and new businesses had opened, but the changes reflected community desires rather than external manipulation. It was gentrification done right, improvement without displacement, growth without loss of character. As Marcus locked the shop and headed home to his apartment, he carried with him the satisfaction of a day spent serving others and building something lasting. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to make a difference. But tonight he could rest in the knowledge that sometimes the little guy really could stand up to the system and win, especially when he remembered that he wasn't standing alone. The grease-covered mechanic had become a symbol of resistance and hope, proving that dignity, courage, and community support could overcome even the most sophisticated forms of economic intimidation. His story would continue to inspire others facing similar battles, while his shop remained a beacon for anyone seeking honest service and genuine human connection in an increasingly impersonal world. Most importantly, Marcus had learned that heroism often looked exactly like ordinary people doing their jobs with integrity and refusing to compromise their principles when tested. The laughter of those who had initially dismissed him had given way to respect, admiration, and recognition that true strength came not from wealth or position, but from the willingness to stand up for what was right, regardless of the cost.